On this channel, we've seen a lot of different weapons, some forgotten by history, others a bit more important, but only a few weapons. They have marked the history of firearms, the history of human conflicts, the history of World War II, like the M1 Garand. Hi everyone. As always, I'm Vlad Sparastoria and I know things. The M1 Garand is not just a semi-automatic rifle. Surely many of you know it either from video games or from movies. Or because in Italy people served in the military with the Garand. But I repeat, the Garand is much more than just a World War II rifle. This was the first semi-automatic rifle that was truly practical and truly mass-produced. The United States was actually the only army to be fully equipped with self-loading weapons. In reality, the development of this weapon would last almost 30 years, also because it broke completely new ground in weapons technology. And in this, it was a huge success, and probably was one of the best, if not the best, individual weapons of World War II. In this video, I'll show you its history, mechanics, use, development, strengths, and weaknesses. And understand why this Garand, this M1 Garand, was so important for history, for the history of firearms. We'll examine, take it apart, test it, and most importantly, experience the fantastic... What happens when it ejects the clip? Developing a semi-automatic rifle is much more difficult than it seems. Enthusiasts, let's call them theorists, are usually those who read or watch videos and get passionate about this world. But even gun owners or collectors tend to focus excessively on certain aspects, such as the operation of the weapon, taking for granted some details that are like Columbus's eggs, meaning obvious to us today, with hindsight. And for that matter, patenting a system for a self-loading weapon is very simple, but making sure that this system is robust enough and suitable for military service is extremely difficult. When we look at the M1 Garand today, we only see a semi-automatic rifle, but that semi-automatic rifle is the result of 34 years of experimentation and testing. It wasn't even close to being the first self-loading rifle, but it was the first one to be truly adopted on a large scale, because it demonstrated the efficiency, robustness, and usefulness of such a system to the whole world. Only after the Garand did it become truly clear and practical that every single soldier could and should be armed with a self-loading weapon. In the early 1900s, the United States was ideal for developing these weapon systems. There were many reasons. The first reason, of course, is that the United States had a large industrial base with private companies and state arsenals that could support the experimentation and production of a range of innovative weapons. The thriving arms market and the strong competition among various companies would provide fertile ground for a whole series of inventors and very important inventions. Among the many names in this regard, let's remember, for example, John Moses Browning or Kieran Maxim, the American who invented the machine gun. The second military reason is less clear. In fact, the United States has always been extremely systematic, more than any other nation, in developing and testing a whole range of equipment. And the reason is very simple, or rather there are two, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. In fact, unless there were unlikely clashes with Canada or Mexico, which did happen, though only to a limited extent, the United States knew very well that the wars they would fight would be overseas wars. Every single piece of equipment had to be packed up and shipped to the other side of the world. And if it was defective or had other problems, replacing it wouldn't have been easy. The United States has always aimed to have the best, not because they had a greater devotion to quality than other nations or armies, but because they knew very well that, strategically speaking, they had to invest in this area. In this regard, the United States created for their army what is the United States Army Ordnance Department, which today has become a corporation. It is a service corps of the United States Army, responsible for the development, production, acquisition, maintenance, and distribution of weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and all combat equipment for the Army. The Corps was founded in 1775 during the American War of Independence and was specifically responsible for procuring and supplying the Army with weapons and ammunition. Over the years, the Corps has expanded its responsibilities, specifically in development, research, and essentially in equipping with every type of necessary item the United States Armed Forces. The Ordnance Department published an annual report for both Army High Command and Congress. In the 1902 report, we read something very interesting for the first time. Recall that in 1902 testing was concluding for what would be the United States' second smokeless powder bolt action rifle. I'm referring to the Springfield 1903, which was later updated for the 3006 cartridge in 1906, even before confirming the new bolt action. It is pointed out in this report that the only drastic improvement that can be made at this time to an infantry weapon system is precisely the adoption of a self-loading system. And that, although they had examined proposals for sidearms, referring to what would become the Colt 1911, they had not yet received any proposals regarding long guns. They officially began accepting proposals from private individuals and companies. It's very interesting that this happened, as I said, in 1902, the year before the adoption of the Springfield. Before the United States adopted their second smokeless powder bolt action rifle, they were already planning ahead. To this end, in the United States, there was a law, specifically requested by the Ordnance, that allowed the sale of a whole range of military components to private individuals. We're mainly talking about barrels and bolts, which are mechanically the most difficult to manufacture, in order to allow these inventors and companies to experiment with various systems and new ideas, especially for those people, those small companies, who perhaps didn't have the necessary machinery to produce these parts. This approach ended up generating a lot of different ideas, some of them completely bizarre and totally senseless. But even if a proposed weapon had some merits, well, as we've said, designing the weapon is the easy part. Production, or rather putting it into production and developing the production technique, is the really difficult part. An inventor would have needed a big company ready to sponsor this idea, or a major American national company like the Springfield Armory, which regularly hired these inventors to work on ideas. As we will see, this happened to Garand. The initial requirement for a self-loading weapon for the United States Army was as simple as it was difficult. The weapon had to be chambered for the 30-06 and not weigh more than the Springfield 1903. Simple requirements on paper, but very hard in practice. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were indeed a number of self-loading designs around the world, but none of these designs met these requirements, especially when it came to weight. For example, let's look at what companies did for the civilian market. Let's think about the Remington Model 8 by John Moses Browning, a weapon that, by the way, we've seen on the channel, which was one of the first successful semi-automatic hunting rifles. An absolutely interesting weapon which would have some very fascinating developments, but certainly not capable of handling the 3006 cartridge, in fact limiting itself to using what we would now, in hindsight, call an intermediate cartridge. Winchester competed with models such as the 1905 and 1907. They also had self-loading carbines in what are intermediate calibers. However, these are rather unusual carbines, with a blowback operation already pushed to the limit by the intermediate cartridge. The 3006 was absolutely unthinkable. The more military market also had very little to offer. The only nation to have officially adopted a self-loading weapon was Mexico in 1907. The Mondragon rifle, which was supposed to be produced in Switzerland, was actually produced in only a few units, most of which ended up in Germany during the First World War. The weapon, however, was not at all satisfactory, not only for the United States, but also for the Germans, who eventually ended up using it. The first weapon that made a positive impression on the Ordnance Department was a weapon proposed by the Dane Soren Hansen Bang through a company known as Madsen. He was also responsible for a very famous development, and later for a light machine gun. If they had only considered the performance on paper and the brief demonstration of the weapon, well, the weapon met the requirements. However, this 1911 rifle hid quite a few flaws. For example, to get around the weight issue, it used an extremely thin stock. The steel parts were also made as thin as possible to save weight. The weapon's reloading system, the so-called gas trap or bang system, worked in a rather counterintuitive way. At the end of the barrel, there was an expansion chamber that could move. The force of the shot filled this chamber, which was pushed forward. As it moved forward, it pulled on a transfer bar that rotated a lever. The lower part of the lever moved forward, while the upper part of the lever moved back, pushing a bolt carrier. Today we're used to nearly all gas systems pushing backward. This occasionally happened, especially in the early days of self-loading weapon development. The Bang system isn't the only one. Another one that comes to mind is the Saint Etienne 1907, a French heavy machine gun. It also has a gas piston that counterintuitively pushes forward. Despite the weapon's failure and these problems, Bang tried to refine the design, proposing another one in 1927, but it exploded on the first shot. Bang's rifle would fall into oblivion, but the gas system he invented was very interesting to the Ordnance Department. It was heavily discussed, reconsidered, and modified, so much so that as a preview, we'll see it again very soon. Many other weapons and systems were tested for this purpose. The English Farquhar, the Mauser 1916, a 1916 Springfield prototype for converting bolt actions to semi-automatics, and one from Rock Island Arsenal. Also in 1916, the prototype rifle of General Liu from the Hanyang Arsenal in China was examined. The Hatcher, the Heinemann, the Vickers-Berthier in two different models, and the Swiss Reichiger, which was basically a Schmidt-Rubin with a very unique gas system attached, were examined. The Thompson rifle and also the French Ribeirol's Sutter Chausha, which was adopted by the French during the First World War. And it was used in significant numbers. It was truly the first semi-automatic self-loading weapon, the infantry rifle used in significant numbers. We could really keep going with this list, and we could dig up from old books some very rare photos of bizarre prototypes. But basically the United States, the Ordnance Department examined every long self-loading weapon system that existed in the world. None was satisfactory, but two designs turned out to be promising. Enter John Cantus Garand, born on January 1st, 1888 in French Canada in Quebec. As a teenager, he moved with his family to Connecticut, where he worked, first in a textile factory, then by helping his brother run a shooting range. From 1908 to 1914, he worked in the production of industrial machinery, eventually becoming chief engineer of the Federal Screw Corporation with his brother. At the same time, he opened many shooting galleries, which were basically recreational indoor shooting ranges. His great passion for shooting and his extensive knowledge of machinery and mechanical skills naturally led him toward the development of firearms. During World War I, he enlisted in the American National Guard, and in a military magazine, he read about the problems the American Army was having with machine guns. Garand decided at that moment that he would be the one to solve that problem. Thanks to his connections in the industrial and military worlds, he had people who would help him develop this idea. What he had in mind was quite unique. He wanted to develop an automatic weapon, a self-loading rifle or a light machine gun that used primer-actuated operation. This peculiar operating system was first patented by Hiram Maxim in 1883, and it will never have any real-world application. There are no weapons in circulation that operate with primer actuation. Only these bizarre prototypes. At the time, though, it was uncharted territory. It required specialized ammunition, but it had the advantage of being extremely compact and lightweight. The operating principle is very simple. There was a special primer in the ammunition that could move back and forth. At the moment of firing, it pushed back the firing pin, which in turn was the bolt carrier of the weapon. The firing pin had a cam and was very heavy, and it could push the bolt back. It seems very strange to us, but I want to emphasize its compactness and lightness. Let me remind you, weight was the biggest problem. The design was strange, but the technical drawings were extremely well done. And since Garand was an expert in production and machinery, they were already anticipating a whole series of production problems and how to solve them. So Garand, in 1919, will be hired by Springfield Armory to keep working on this design. The first prototype from 1919 will be followed by a second model, called the T-20. On December 23, 1919, the Ordnance Department received a letter from the Infantry Committee and the Cavalry Committee to prepare a series of tests for self-loading weapons. They wanted to see an improved Bang rifle, but they also wanted to explore other self-loading systems, such as light machine guns for the cavalry. Major James Hatcher would then develop a new self-loading weapon system based on the Bang system, which actually, besides the name and the vague idea of the gas trap system, had little in common with the Mace armament. Garand presented his first 1919 prototype for these tests since the T-20 wasn't ready. And other companies as well, like Colt Thompson or foreign designs like the Vickers Berthier, also took part in these tests. These latter weapons were discarded, but it was recommended to continue the development of Hatcher's weapons, the modified Bang, and Garand's rifle. Other weapons were also tested though, like a Remington Model 8 in .25 caliber, an important detail for later. At this point, none of these weapons were ready for service. But these tests had the important merit of convincing everyone that developing a self-loading weapon weighing less than 10 pounds was absolutely feasible and possible. On February 11, 1921, a circular specified the requirements a bit better. The weapon had to be light, compact, and fed by a clip from 5 to 10 kil and preferably 10. It had to have a hold open and a manual safety. It had to be as accurate as the Springfield 1903 and had to weigh 9.5 pounds. Later, it was further reduced to 8.5 pounds. There were many other minor requirements, which I won't list now, and a series of 10 different tests that the weapons would be subjected to, from disassembly to accuracy to reliability with underpowered and overpowered cartridges. A durability test of 5,000 rounds and a test for resistance to dirt and sand. Garand, unfortunately, didn't make it in time to participate in these tests. His new weapon, his next iterative step, would only be ready at the end of 1921. None of the weapons in these tests were satisfactory, but continued development was recommended. Garand's 1921 weapon was very different from his first rifle. It still used the bizarre primer system, but to further simplify everything, instead of using a rotating bolt, a tilting bolt was used. In March 1922, it was tested and it was decided to produce 24 prototypes for further testing. So at this point, it would seem that Garand was well on his way to adoption. But there was a very important dissenting voice, a voice that would soon make itself heard. We mentioned that Remington introduced the Model 8 in .25 caliber. Remington was able to convince the Ordnance Department to continue testing this weapon and to propose not only a new variant of the Model 8, but also to convince them to test a cartridge that was different from the 3006, one that was smaller in caliber, faster, and with a flatter trajectory. The mind behind this move by Remington was engineer John Peterson, author of various designs such as the Remington 1910 pump-action rifle and the top-secret project known as the Peterson device. A device that replaced the bolt of a Springfield, converting it into a self-loading carbine. Pedersen was a well-known and respected gunsmith. John Moses Browning said that Pedersen was the greatest living firearms inventor. When John Moses Browning gives you a compliment like that, it means you're a great inventor. He argued, together with Remington with great conviction, that the new military self-loading weapon should first and foremost have a 70 mm caliber or two 7.6 inches. The cartridge would therefore have a smaller, lighter bullet with a flatter trajectory, but the case would also have a different shape to facilitate feeding and extraction in self-loading weapons. Shorter than the 30-06, resulting in a more compact magazine and action. It used 30-06 smokeless powder and was designed to create less friction. According to calculations, it would have heated up just 60% as much as the 30-06, enabling longer sustained fire. The lighter weight of the ammunition also had logistical advantages. Producing 1 million rounds would save 1,500 kilo of lead and 1,200 kilo of powder. It wasn't perfect because the lower performance was definitely noticeable with specialized ammunition. Since the bullet was smaller and lighter, it didn't fit very well with ammunition like armor-piercing or tracer rounds. However, Pedersen was convincing, and in 1924, funds were allocated to continue developing this ammunition. The rifle he wanted to pair with this ammunition was also very unique. In fact, it was a rifle with a toggle-delayed action. A very unique system used only in one other weapon, the Austro-Hungarian Schwarzlos 1907 heavy machine gun. In fact, the toggle was not used to complete the locking, as in a Maxim or Winchester, but instead acted as a mechanical disadvantage during opening. Meanwhile, in 1924, there were other tests involving the Garand and the Thompson. The Garand was considered absolutely superior to the latter, even though both were still unsatisfactory. In 1925, however, Peterson's weapon and the ammunition were finally ready. It was then requested that the Garand and Thompson rifles be tested alongside the Peterson. In 276, however, major upcoming changes would drastically alter the Garand. In fact, in 1925, a new version of the 30-06 ammunition was adopted, known as the M1. The more valuable progressive powder and the heavier bullet caused the mechanical balance of the Garand to be somewhat compromised. And the primer operation of the Garand simply worked very badly. Look at how an apparently insignificant change, like changing the type of powder and the bullet weight, can kill or give life to a weapon system. Garand therefore requested to modify his weapon for the new tests, and the design change was radical. He would completely abandon the primer operation to adapt the system. Bang and Hatcher's weapon will not be pursued further. But Garand, since he knew this design, because he tested it, because he did comparative tests with it, simply went ahead and used it. It was already owned by the United States, the patents were there, so it wasn't a big problem. He placed a gas piston under the muzzle and encapsulated everything together. It was all simpler than Bang, because when the bullet left the muzzle, the gas filled this capsule, a capsule in which there was a piston that was pushed back. For the bolt will go back to the very first Garand from 1919, so a rotating bolt with two locking lugs operated by a hop rod. A charging handle with a diagonal cam that strongly resembled the French Ribeirolis, Suter Shosha of 1917, already thoroughly tested previously by Hornets. This weapon was also still in 30-06, but towards the end, in 1927, Garand from Springfield Armory was suggested to produce this weapon. In 276, Pedersen for further testing. However, the discussion about which ammunition was better was extremely heated. It involved all branches of the armed forces, including the Navy and the Marines. On October 1, 1928, a new competition was announced. By July 1, 1929, a self-loading weapon in 276 had to be presented. Peterson, Garand, and the Springfield Armory spent intense months adapting the design to this new caliber. 6 weapons would participate in these tests in July 1928. The Browning, by the way, written as I pronounce it in Italian, not the Browning of John Moses Browning. A Dutch design whose chamber dimensions were incorrect, and it failed on the first day of the test. Created by John Moses Browning's half-brother. A rather complicated design, but one that will have a very interesting successor in the Winchester M1 carbine, the Czechoslovakian Z29, a fairly interesting design, the European Thompson rifle, the Pedersen rifle, the Garand rifle. As an exception, because it was submitted late, a German design by Rheinmetall, invented by a certain Karl Heinemann, was accepted, also loosely based on the Danish Bang system. This weapon is very interesting because, although it failed in the tests, it would serve as the basis for another very interesting and famous weapon, namely the Gewehr 41 of World War II by Walter. At the end of the extremely tough tests, only 2 designs emerged intact, the Pedersen and, of course, the Garand. However, the final victory belonged to the Garand. It was simpler, lighter, and unlike the Pedersen, it didn't require lubricated ammunition to aid extraction. Other tests followed, mainly aimed at finally resolving the controversy over the ammunition. Many in the army supported the 276 Pedersen, but there were some fairly significant objections, especially those concerning the logistics chain. Obviously, having another type of ammunition or switching to a new caliber was complicated and expensive. Garand himself spontaneously proposed his own version of this new system in 30-06 in 1931, but it broke and was rejected. A document from December 1931 approved for the following fiscal year, 1932, the production of a limited pre-series of the Garand. Meanwhile, Pedersen appealed these decisions. In all this, however, General Douglas MacArthur intervened and said no. General Douglas MacArthur did not want a cartridge. Furthermore, an order on February 25th ordered the immediate cessation of the .276 caliber programs and the production of the 30-06 caliber for the GARAND and for the PEDERSEN. If the Pedersen in 1931 was evaluated as slightly inferior to the Garand, with this definitive change of caliber, the whole structure collapsed. Garand was. Springfield had actually worked on the 3006 from the start. They briefly switched to the 276 Pedersen, then returned to the 30-06 in a 1931 experiment. Pedersen himself never made the weapon in 30-06. And to adapt this system would have taken a lot of time that, quite simply, the Americans did not have for this process. The Garand was superior. On August 3, 1933, the Garand would be designated as the M1 and entered pre-production. Tests with the troops would follow in 1934 and 1935 up until January 9, 1936, when it was officially adopted. As mentioned before, at the beginning, the difficult part was production, and Garand and Springfield, once the design was approved, focused deeply on this aspect. For example, from the initial 1,100 machine operations needed to produce all the components of the weapon, they managed to reduce it to almost half. However, there were some problems caused by a series of design flaws. These things are quite normal, and practically every weapon design always has a problem at the beginning of production. Even the famous Kalashnikov itself had a lot of problems for 10 years. The first of the serious problems with the Garand was something very peculiar, the so-called 7th round jam. The Garand's clip, in fact, holds 8 rounds fed alternately from the right or from the left. And it doesn't matter whether the first round is on the right or on the left. It could be loaded in either way. And the clips provided, let's say to the army, were mixed. No one paid attention to which round was loaded on top first. Well, it turned out that if the first round was on the right, and consequently all the odd ones as well. So even the 7th round inside the clip, the weapon right on the 7th round would fail to feed it. Interestingly, this did not happen if the 7th round or the first, so the odd ones were on the left. This issue had not been noticed at all during the exercises. The problem was so serious that there were people suggesting to completely cut off the head of this program. Also because there were other people with other designs like Melvin Minor Johnson with what would become the Johnson 1941, who suggested they could definitely do better with fewer problems than the Garand. The immediate solution was to use and load the clips exclusively with the first round on the left. But the definitive solution came when an employee of the Springfield Armory, a certain Walter Campbell, had a brilliant idea. He noticed, in fact, that the weapons clip, even when full, had a lot of play and there was something wrong. So, on his own initiative, he modified a weapon in such a way that it put more pressure on the clip from the right side and the jams disappeared completely. While studying this insight from Campbell, Colonel Hatcher, yes, the same one from the Agassiz system, finally found the solution. What was the problem? In fact, during the milling operations of the receivers, at a certain point, too much material was mistakenly removed from the right side of the receiver, which didn't properly support the clip. Quickly corrected, actually, this issue in the machine responsible for this incorrect cut. The problem stopped completely. The second major modification concerned the gas system. In fact, the Bang gas system had 2 flaws. The minor one was that it got dirty a lot. But think about it. The most important flaw found was that it was quite fragile. It would get distorted when used heavily. The bayonet, since the bayonet is fundamental. The gas system was redesigned with a classic gas port and a long-stroke piston. This modification was approved on October 26, 1990. This makes the so-called gas trap Garand, that is, Garand rifles with the first gas system, extremely rare and extremely expensive on the collector's market due to the small number produced. The long history lesson is over for now. So first of all, let's move the camera and take a closer look at how the Garand is made. Then we'll enjoy an animation to get a better look at how the various small parts work, and of course we'll do a nice practical test at the shooting range. Here we are taking a look at this amazing M1 Garand. I'd like to show you that even though this was re-arsenalized at some point in the 1950s by the Turney factory, all the components are American. As we can see, the rest is written on the weapon. This is a real Springfield. Not only was Springfield, of course, producing them, but also many other companies to support the war effort. We'll get to the bayonet later on. But the most obvious thing about the Garand, of course, is the clip. This clip, as we saw during its development, underwent some changes, but it was something that the American Army strongly wanted. It is perhaps the last instance, the last opportunity, the last situation in which a clip that we could call en bloc or Mannlicher clip was actually used. The Garand was modern, innovative, and exceptional in many ways. The clip, in my opinion, is not one of those. Also because it's a technology that would die out after the Garand. Where detachable magazines objectively will be better, it will be shown that it's possible to make a detachable magazine that's both affordable and reliable. So the whole reason for the clip, which is that it's cheaper than the magazine, will cease to exist. Let's set this inert clip aside. We'll need it for a few demonstrations later. Let's begin the weapon tour. Many of you may know it from military service. We'll start at the front. At the front, there's the muzzle, and just below it is the gas piston. Here in the gas tube, there is a piston. The operating mechanism is a long-stroke piston. As we have seen, the very first Garands used a gas trap derived from the bang system, but starting from about serial number 10,000 onwards, this system was completely changed. This makes the Garands with the gas trap extremely expensive and desirable. Honestly, I've never seen one myself, just in photos. Due to their rarity, they sell for hundreds of thousands at auction. One of the most expensive rifles you can possibly have is in fact a Garand with a gas trap going down under the gas tube. We have this part here, which is the bayonet mount. The bayonet can simply be removed from its sheath and attached to the weapon. Please note, something very interesting about this bayonet that the owner of the weapon told me. He's a collector, a reenactor, so he has a whole series of accessories that we'll see in this video. This bayonet is a wartime find from the Gothic line, so it was probably used in battle. And this makes the review of this weapon, this tour of the weapon, even more fascinating. To remove the bayonet, we have a button here underneath that we need to press all the way down. Sorry I took it off camera, but it's pretty hard to remove. Another thing that becomes clear during the live fire test is that this weapon heats up at a certain point. I will want to remove the bayonet, but the weapon was so hot that you'll see many firing sequences with the bayonet attached. It began unintentionally, but eventually became a stylistic choice. The weapon is too hot, so we keep the bayonet on for you to grab here. I even got burned, unfortunately. Weapons get really hot. Going back, we have the first part of the handguard. As you can see, the handguard, going back, covers the entire length of the barrel. This is very important for being able to grip the weapon in various conditions. I repeat, it gets very hot. And having some kind of cover that insulates the barrel helps with handling. Maybe it doesn't help with cooling, as some might point out, but for cooling, simply put, there's some space underneath here. A bit of air circulates around this part. This part that looks a bit poorly assembled, but actually has wide tolerances. They're actually designed on purpose to let air pass through properly. Moving further back, we find the first attachment point for the belt. Note that this one we see here in the front is not an attachment point for the belt, but it's a hook for making the weapon bundle. Maybe you've heard about this? With this hook, you can attach 3 rifles together and place them vertically. So for example, instead of placing them on the ground where there may be dirt or mud, they stand upright. So they're isolated from any potential dirt you might find around. Going further back, we see the weapon's first controls, starting with the safety, which is this component. With this hole, by the way, many have asked what this hole is for. It actually serves 2 purposes. First, you can insert the safety and pass a cable or a padlock through here to lock the weapon in the safe position. For example, when it is kept in a rack. But the real reason why this hole is here is simply for a manufacturing purpose. When these pieces were finished, they were blued. The trigger mechanism was hooked through this hole so it could hang and be properly treated by the chemicals. So, a production requirement that wasn't in the original guards. Obviously, wartime needs would greatly simplify production. As we've seen, from 1,100 machine operations, it goes down to almost half when it comes to production. The other control that we quite obviously find is this button here. This button is the clip retention button, and it's used to remove the clip when we don't need it, when we want to unload the weapon. So, in a way, it's similar to the magazine release. We don't have a removable magazine. We have, I repeat, the clip. But this button actually performs, as far as handling the weapon goes, exactly the same function. In a moment, we'll load this inert clip to demonstrate a few things. Going back, of course, we find the trigger and we find the sight mount, which is actually a diopter, and it's fantastic. I absolutely love the sights on the Garand. I don't know what Americans do with their guns, but if there's one thing Americans consistently get right on almost all their weapons throughout history, it's the sights. Fantastic. Maybe it's the frontier culture, the culture of precision shooting done properly, the culture of practical shooting, we could say, rather than target shooting. They make these sights extremely practical, but also very precise. Note this sight. It's adjustable both for elevation and windage, but that's a second version. One of the flaws of the original Garand was precisely the relative weakness of its sights. The sight systems were then changed towards the end of the war, and these here are the later ones. Even when they were rationalized, like this one here in Italy, even though it was American made, these sights were of a new version. Going back to the stock, here we see the stock from the Armi di Terni factory, number 69, I repeat, a different stock here, rationalized but with all American components. From the right side of the weapon, as we move, we can see its operation a bit better. That is, we get a better look at its bolt, which is slightly more visible from the right side. Because as you can see, when it's in battery, it's not perfectly horizontal, but slightly about 10-15 degrees tilted to the right, we can see the bolt carrier. The op rod, the operating rod, is obviously pushed by the gas piston, which moves in this way to operate the weapon, first causing the bolt to rotate and then starting the corresponding cycle. What does this operating rod remind you of? A French weapon, the Ribeyrolles Sutter Chauchat 1917, was essentially the first op. Let's set the Mondragon aside. A true semi-automatic weapon adopted in substantial numbers by an army, the Ribeyrolles Sutter Chauchat, was one of the weapons competing, in fact, in the American trials to become the new semi-automatic weapon. And after the redesign of the Garand to a gas-operated system, first obviously the one operated in United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, there are so many things that really remind you of the Ribeyrolles Sutter Chauchat 1917. It's clear, it's obvious that Garand, but especially the team at the Springfield Armory, were inspired by the technical solutions of that weapon, which they had and knew very well. To complete the equipment of the weapon, obviously there's this very useful sling. By the way, it looks like a very complicated sling, but this sling is actually made for fairly precise shooting. In fact, you can pass your arm through this opening to pull everything very tightly against your body. It's a precision shooting technique, especially while standing, but also when lying down, that simply put many rifle shooters, as well as others, don't know very well. If you watch Olympic shooting, for example, at 50 meters from the ground, shooters always have the sling because it really helps a lot with the rigidity of the weapon. The Americans weren't stupid. Garand was someone who came from recreational target shooting and knew this technique very well. Even the Americans themselves, with their match with the National Rifle Association, they had in fact a culture of precision shooting, of shooting competitions. This sling is a fantastic sling which helps a lot from this point of view. One last thing we want to look at on the stock is this fantastic little door that can be opened. You can go, To remove a whole series of accessories necessary for cleaning, here we really have everything you need for cleaning and for a thorough disassembly. An extremely useful kit from this point of view. Before disassembling the weapon further, I want to show you a few things regarding loading. We'll see it a bit better during the live fire test, but there are quite a few myths regarding the clip. In particular, the so-called Garand thumb. The Garand has a reputation for biting people's hands and leaving nasty marks, known in the United States as Garand thumb. Honestly, it's something extremely easy to avoid if you have even a basic understanding of how the weapon works. From my experience, nearly all of these incidents are just minor injuries and not really dangerous. Especially if I have a sore thumb, maybe a broken nail. They come from the fact that this weapon is handled when unloaded. Because when loading a clip, I challenge anyone to hurt themselves loading a clip. It's very hard. Personally, I haven't seen it happen. Now, when the weapon is unloaded and I pull back the slide will stay open. That's because the mechanism, as we'll see when we take a closer look at how the weapon works, is perfectly connected to the operating axis. It's all a single mechanism. The elevator spring is actually the same as the recoil spring. This is something that was deliberately modified, designed to make loading as easy as possible. When there are no rounds, it's not the elevator that blocks the bolt, but rather an element up here in the front, which we'll see when we disassemble it, connected to the system that rises high enough to lock the bolt back. Right now we see the weapons elevator, which, as you can see, can feed from both the right and the left. Also because these clips are double column with alternating presentation, and they can be loaded with the top round either on the right or on the left without any issue. Since this whole elevator mechanism is connected to the charging handle, it's important to keep one thing in mind. As long as we keep pressure on the rounds on the clip, the bolt won't release. The moment we reach the end of the loading process and the clip locks into the system, by releasing the pressure on the clip itself, at that moment the bolt will close. Sometimes it closes by itself, sometimes it needs a little tap because it actually stops here on top of the clip where the rounds are. So many people recommend loading the Garand by making strange hand movements, trying to block the charging handle. I'll quickly show you there's nothing to fear if you keep pressure with your hand. So I insert the clip, I apply pressure, you see, and at this moment the weapon snaps. The moment I release the pressure, the shutter closes. Sometimes you need to give it a tap, since it might be slowed by the first round, but let's try again. Here we are, let's remove it. This is a bit embarrassing. Let's remove the clip. As you can see, by pressing this button here, on this side we can remove the clip. So you guys who are scared, are you saying that the Garand bites the clip decisively? After all, see, this time it didn't close. You need to give it a little tap. The Garand will never bite your hands if you handle it confidently and with confidence. Push the clip down. Only when you release the pressure on the clip will it want to close. You just need to lift your thumb quickly enough. You don't even need any special tricks to avoid this. So make sure you're confident. Let's go again. To remove it. Here is the clip. Let's repeat with the dummy round. I don't think a third demonstration is needed to show that the weapon doesn't bite. If you insert the clip, again, there's no need to make any strange movements with your hand as some suggest. Take the clip, insert it confidently, and release it decisively. The Garand is docile, will never bite you, and is actually good. Thank you very much. Here you go. Nothing happened, just the disassembly. Exactly. The only issue is when people start putting their hands inside the Garand. When there are no rounds like this, it's in these moments that, the clips are released and someone, maybe with their thumb, you can hurt yourself. But if you put rounds in, I repeat, with inert rounds, nothing will really happen to you. You just need to understand how this weapon works and all the secrets will be clear to disassemble it. Let's take a closer look at how it works. This way, I'll also show you why the clip releases the bolt carrier at one moment rather than another. To disassemble the weapon, ensure it's unloaded and cock the hammer first. It will be easier since we are going to move the trigger sear forward. A movement that in reality will cock the hammer if it happens to be uncocked. To avoid struggling against the hammer spring itself, it's better to have the hammer already cocked. So let's take it, let's see, like this. We lift it up. This way we can remove the whole trigger mechanism. We notice the hammer and the spring that powers the hammer is actually contained in this small cylinder. We also notice the weapon's safety, which physically works by simply blocking the hammer's path, thus disconnecting the system and making it perfectly safe. In fact, this way I can't pull the trigger, as you can see. By bringing them forward again, however, this movement is possible. We also notice what appears to be the floor plate, the bottom part that closes the magazine underneath. But actually, all the parts of the magazine are inside the action of the weapon. At this point, we can go to separate the wood of the weapon, as you can see, properly shaped and hollowed out inside. And we can take a look at the actual action of the weapon. Now, actually, at this moment, a lot of different things are happening. In particular, there is this extension that operates a whole series of elements inside the weapon, but it also has the spring, which in turn interacts with the bolt carrier. In fact, let's actually see how it moves and how it gets compressed. This one here is barely visible right now, it's the weapons elevator. With this hook actually, when the ammunition runs out, it will push up and catch the bolt carrier. Right now, there is no ammunition. So this part, when we compress the spring by pushing the bolt carrier back, will catch the bolt carrier itself. Look. There, it rises up. And there, it has grabbed the bolt carrier. When I insert the ammunition, I actually lower it. I release it. Let's see exactly what happens then. Watch here. I'm inserting the ammunition. It's a bit difficult to do this on camera, but look here. I'm inserting the ammunition. This way, I'll lower the elevator. Look here, and at the stroke's end, you see. The bolt carrier is released at the moment when this whole system is stopped by the presence of the cartridge and the clip itself. There is nothing mechanical that physically holds this system. Actually, it's the friction of the components themselves that does it. So when I release the pressure, this friction stops. The weapon goes into battery and the bolt closes, so you just need to keep the pressure so it doesn't close. Open the bolt again and remove the clip. So you're not afraid to use the Garand. This is what happens physically. As you can see, this whole system, this gauge is connected to the elevator. Actually, we can take a closer look at how this thing works. In fact, we can actually start by disassembling the weapon. To do that, we need to disconnect this system. It's pretty simple. We pull the spring back. Removing it this way exposes the long recoil spring. And this hook, we could say, is what operates. The elevator is basically what acts as the hold open of the weapon. So now we have the gas tube, the actual bolt carrier. Now, the elevator already wants to come out. As you can see, it swings on its own. These parts that no longer have spring tension don't have anything controlling them. As you can see, at this height, there is a notch, a kind of widening on the cam. We could say that it controls the movement of the bolt carrier itself. At this point, we can pull back the bolt carrier. And finding the right spot often takes a bit of wiggle, so to speak. And here we find the right spot. We can remove the charging handle. For a moment, it would rotate. All right? So we have the very long... I produced it. They call it American, but in fact it's a bolt carrier connected by a very long rod to the gas piston. Now, gentlemen, this here from a distance should remind you of another very famous weapon. Or rather, this whole upside-down system should remind you of another weapon, the Kalashnikov. In the 1990s, it was said that he took a lot of inspiration from the M1 Garand when creating the Kalashnikov. The Kalashnikov bolt carrier is a bit bigger in this area, but in many ways it's almost identical to this gas piston. Chepia, pretty much. The way it works is analogous. You don't see this functioning so much in the same forms, but rather in the analogous functions of the various components. We can, at this moment, by moving it forward, simply remove the weapon's bolt. So let's take it apart, and we have a bolt with two locking lugs. These are locking lugs. Remove this element, this protrusion, which interacts precisely with the cam, in the bolt carrier to cause it to rotate, where we saw two locking lugs that interact with the carrier in a very similar way. Bolt in the Kalashnikov, exactly. For the rest, it's a fairly light bolt. Here, actually slightly off axis, we see the weapon's firing pin to remove the rest of the components. We can use the tool that we conveniently saw placed inside the stock. We can push it out. This pin, which actually comes out quite easily. In this way, we have the elevator and the loader. They come out slowly. This ammunition guide, this elevator transfer rod. It's what is technically called the bolt catch, the part that grabs the bolt when the ammunition runs out. Let's take a closer look, thanks to World of Guns, at how the M1 Garand is made and how it works. Let's start at the front, where the gas system is located. When the weapon is fired, a hole made here, we can also see it in the barrel, lets the gas through, which simply pushes the piston back. The piston, which is a single piece with the op rod, and of course, it will move the bolt. The weapon's extractor, which is this part, firmly holds the rim of the cartridge. During these operations, we can see a little better how it works. It holds the cartridge until the cartridge is free from the barrel, at which point it's a bit easier to see. On the other side, the cartridge is no longer held in any way except by the extractor. The ejector pin, with its own spring that applies constant pressure, forces the cartridge to come out. When fed, the new cartridge will be caught by the extractor. The hammer. In this housing, this cover has its own spring. We can remove this part to see it a little better. While the bolt, this large piece, is actually made up of two parts, but they move in sync. Attached to this piece, there is this second hook, which is the disconnector of the trigger system. When we fire, this hook moves forward, releasing the hammer. When the weapon cycles, the trigger is held down. This secondary hook, which is also pushed by the same spring as the hammer, makes it catch, thus disconnecting the action. Until I release the trigger at this moment, which makes the hammer connect again to the trigger itself, thus allowing only semi-automatic fire. By the way, this type of system with two elements that hook onto the hammer and hold it back is present in many different firearms, including quite obviously the Kalashnikov itself. The safety is this large hook with this strange protrusion. When we engage it, it will physically hook onto the hammer and move it slightly downward. Obviously, releasing the safety will have the opposite effect. This spring is a very interesting feature. It's the spring that pops out the clip, helping to create that typical ping. But it's also the spring that, when returning, doubles as the spring that holds the safety itself in place. A very interesting and clever use of two different parts. Now let's observe the steps of loading the weapon and see exactly what happens when the weapon is loaded and unloaded. First, we insert a new clip. The clip will be pushed right by the elevator and will be caught by this part that holds the clip itself, which we can also use to release it. And it will come under pressure from this spring in the final part of the movement. Also, note that World of Guns doesn't show it clearly here, because actually this part moves a little later. This is a bit of a problem with the correct synchronization of the parts, in my opinion. But it releases. Good job, Puffies. Who will be able to move forward by chambering the round. Now we will virtually fire all the rounds, and you will see how the same recoil spring, by pushing on the elevator, will make it go up. Watch as the elevator begins to rise in each shot. With the final round loaded, several interesting things occur. The elevator at this point is high enough that when the bolt opens, a series of things will happen. With the last round, this element that needs to intercept the bolt carrier, the op rod, is high enough. With the last part of the elevator's movement, it will intercept and latch onto the charging handle. At the same time, something else will happen. I want you to now look at this extension of this part. While this part goes up, it will catch the op rod, and this extension goes down. By pressing down, it will trigger the release of the clip, which, since it's under spring tension, will pop out. Here he presses it and releases the clip. If you notice the camera change, it's because I switched cameras. One of them simply ran out of battery, so I hope you'll forgive me. This potential cacophony or cacovigia, whatever it's called, well, it doesn't matter. Let's go. You know what? Let's reassemble this weapon so we can also see the reverse process. Now, to get these parts in, you have to put everything together and fit it like it's Tetris, because everything has to fit onto this little piece. So first, let's go ahead and put these two aligned parts together. This, of course, is the bolt catch, the one that stops the bolt carrier. This instead is the ammunition guide inside the ammunition guide. Then we pass through the extension that will interact with the weapon's elevator. We insert the extension inside the guide. The weapon's elevator, which in turn must interact with this extension when everything is perfectly aligned, which it isn't right now, when everything is nicely aligned. Let's see if we can do it. Let's see here. By the way, it starts from this side. Yes, here. Here we go, here we are, here we go, here we are. As you can see, does everything go together? You need to play a bit with the alignments. With a bit of practice, it becomes much easier, to be honest. At this point, we can insert the bolt into the weapon, making sure that it goes into the proper guides. Here we go. Here is the bolt of the weapon, which can now slide smoothly like this. Let's pull it back a little because we need to find the right spot to go. The forward, the shutter port. Here it is. We need to find the spot. Align the two parts again and find the spot. Here you go. Where the two parts interact, they interact together. At this point, we can move everything forward to have less tension on the spring. Let's insert the return spring and use this hook to attach the lever that controls the levers. And this mechanism in every move. Now what we actually have left to do is just to assemble the weapon. Inside the wood, the anger is here. And then we can go put in the trigger mechanism. Here we are. Let's insert our trigger mechanism. It should go in easily. Once we've found the right alignment, by finding the right alignment, here we go. A bit in the center, we've got it. We can put the jumper back on. One last thing we could actually do from the front is access the gas system. To access the gas system, for example, for cleaning, we can insert this key. I repeat, everything contained in the stock here is a screw. This tool is not particularly comfortable, but it definitely helps when levering to disassemble everything. If we have a screwdriver, it's slightly more ergonomic, but it doesn't fit into the weapon's stock. Very nice. There we go. We can unscrew it. We can do it this way. Remove. This single block, actually it's the gas pipe with the hole for the gas to pass through. We actually see it here, almost at the end of the barrel, the hole, which kind of gives away the fact that this was a gas trap weapon, and we can see the barrel itself like this. Here's the gas port that enters the system. And as you can see, when the gas comes out and expands into this tube, it pushes back the gas piston, which will cycle the weapon. Obviously, to reassemble everything, it's simply a matter of doing the reverse operation. So just put the gas tube with its piston, slide it forward here, and screw this part in completely. which is an accessory also useful for attaching the grenade launcher, or for example, the adapter for reenactors, the adapter for blank ammunition. Oh, let's install the plug here, this gas plug. We screw it in easily using the provided tool. Provided, let's see it this way. But here it is. Here it is. We can now close the tool and put it in the stock. So this goes. Everything like this, all straight here. We can then put this container with the cleaning brush. And here we have some grease, which also goes inside the stock of the weapon. Let's close the door. The weapon is ready to use, not particularly simple, but not too complicated either. Considering this is a 1930s weapon name, another from that era, as efficient as a self-loading system. Spoiler, you won't. Once the weapon is reassembled, let's take it to the shooting range. It's a real pleasure to use and shoot. You can tell I'm in love. Let's go. We're finally at the 414 in Brony to try the M1 Garand, as always, with plenty of ammo. We have some end block clips, or Moliker clips if you prefer. 8 round clips, 8 and not 10. That's because of the caliber change it underwent during development. Now handling it is quite simple. To load it, we open it. Let's see if you can see. Insert the clip. Remember to keep pressing A. The weapon is ready to load. I'll show you maybe a bit better. Let's try a few shots. Ha ha. So, from my old video, you know I've already tried and shot with the Garand, which has been discussed a lot. But every time I pick it up again, it's a great pleasure. Ergonomically speaking, even though it's basically a weapon from World War I, in some ways it's very well made. It's relatively heavy, but the weight is concentrated in the back part, and the gas system, in fact, is relatively light. So almost all the weight is concentrated in the back. And if we hold it right here, where this shape is, where the magazine is, actually the weight of the weapon is perfectly balanced here. This is exactly the center of gravity, so it fits perfectly to the shape of the hand. The grip of the pistol really helps a lot in holding the weapon, and overall it's an extremely well-designed ergonomic weapon. And that's not something to underestimate. It took them 30 years to actually adopt this weapon. And as we said, these are things that Americans do, that Americans used to do. They often presented them as perfection, frankly. If we exclude Survivor 44, since that's a totally new concept, this is likely the best rifle of World War II. It's no coincidence it served in so many armies like the Italian one for so long. Some people, as discussed, are afraid of clips, not really understanding how they work. The most important trick with the Garand is to put pressure on the ammunition to prevent the bolt from closing, because when you release the pressure, the bolt will close. Honestly, all the cases of Garand thumb that I've seen and heard about have always happened with an unloaded weapon, while handling the unloaded weapon and loading the ammunition. It's pretty hard to hurt yourself, so insert the clip, apply pressure, and we apply pressure. And it's not a problem. You can easily avoid hurting your hand. Oh, little malfunction. It's a weapon. Okay. It can happen sometimes. Especially considering that these clips are reused, the weapon's property was actually single use. This is perhaps the biggest limitation of any system that uses clips. Mannlicher. Let's move the camera, try a few more shots, and I'll keep telling you what I think. I'd give it lots of kisses. The bayonet might seem like a superfluous accessory on a self-loading weapon, and it is. But what do we do if we're in the jungle, like the one by the canal? And the Japanese attack us up close? To defend yourself in an extreme case, it could be vaguely useful. Let's see. There are some... No. No anime. The firepower that a self-loading weapon gives is immense. There are people on the web and on gun forums, experts, who tell me that by training with a bolt action you can achieve the same firepower. It's a ridiculous and simply false thing. The semi-automatic weapon allows for versatility and a volume of fire, especially in combat situations that single-shot or bolt-action weapons can only dream of. The Garand was the first semi-automatic weapon widely adopted, though not the very first ever made. And the American Army was really the only army in World War II to be fully equipped with semi-automatic weapons. American infantry squads had an immense firepower that no one else had. And there's no doubt about it, that's for sure. The Garand, as General Patton truly said, was perhaps one of the greatest inventions, not the Garand itself, but the semi-automatic weapon. This multiplies the force, and there's a reason why it lasted as long as it did. Thank you all for watching this video. As always, remember that you are the ones who make these videos. Today, someone who owns this weapon came here specifically to let me film it, so if you have some nice weapons, make sure to subscribe. We'll get in touch and film them. If you want to actively contribute to the channel, consider subscribing. You can click below and support me financially. Doing these things, as you surely know, is not free at all. If you want, there's also the t-shirt shop. We have some beautiful new designs just for you. If you can't or don't want to, please consider sharing or commenting. I like this video. As a Californian company, it dislikes firearms. YouTube, let's hit that like button to show our support. As usual, I'll see you next time.